in League of Legends, we all kind of know that having a more late game oriented team comp is probably the better idea because a early game team composition is kind of hard to play. Even for pro players or pro teams, you see this quite often that a lot of teams will just opt into late game team compositions rather than early game. And I think the big reason for that is simply because you don't really see the consequence of an action. Like, just think about your daily life. In general, you don't really see the consequences of an action, of not doing something, of not rectifying a situation, so to speak, if it's not too bad, right? That's why a lot of people either leave their room completely messy and maybe they don't look for the new job or they don't look for an increase in their salary or whatnot because they're just comfortable living in the existence that they know, or I guess the small evil that they know. But in all reality, inaction is actually what can lead to a terrible fucking life. It's kind of the same thing as having an action of, not trying to get a family or not trying to get kids, and then suddenly it creeps up on you and you're just like, what the fuck? So inaction in League of Legends is exactly what's happening to early game team compositions, which is why it's so difficult to do them. So now we can look at some champions that are early game, champions like Lucian or Draven, Jace classically, right? Shaco, Pike, Kha'Zix, things like that. And then you think of late game champions like Kayle or Karthus, Vladimir, Smolder, right? Now, Master Yi for, solo queue, Fiora, even Bel'Veth, I guess, one of the newer champions. All of these, are classic champions that either relate to early game or late game. And oftentimes, a lot of people don't like those specific champions for at least early game champions. When you see them in your own team composition or in pro play, they're often not picked a lot. Classically, of course, Jace in North America is always memed about, and it's because it's usually an early game champion. They've kind of shored that up a little bit, and he's okay in the mid game, but he still sucks ass during the late game. And it's because you need to start making moves immediately during the early game, or else you're kind of fucked. It's like, I don't know if you guys have played Zelda Majora's Mask, but the ticking clock is very intimidating, whereas it's like 12 hours to, doomsday. Like, that's that's exactly what's happening in League of Legends, is you have an impending doomsday. And I think that's what scares people from going for early game team compositions, because essentially what you have to do is you have to create your own objectives. There aren't classically objectives that you need to go for when you have an early game team composition, because the game doesn't tell you to go for this objective, right? Like a Drake or a Baron. Those things only come every 5 minutes, right? And then you have to wait for Baron at 20 minutes. So obviously you need more shit to do on the map with an early game team composition. We're talking towers, we're talking go for plates, we're talking get vision priority over in one side of the enemy jungle or, the river, so that your team can press up and push waves. Invading, of course, that's in lieu of that, to where you can take one quadrant of the entire map and make it yours so that your team has an advantage down there and you can push for these turret plates for, like actual CSing and a CS advantage. Or, Grubs is also another early game objective that luckily Riot has put in, to where it rewards you then if you're able to push up your lanes and you have lane leads, and you have stronger lanes to then, of course, get turret plates and get turrets themselves. But I think the big problem and why early game team compositions are so hated is because Riot has simply conditioned their player base to follow directions, right? Like to follow a traditional game flow of what is League of Legends. Because if you think about it end of the day, and you had to describe League of Legends to someone that doesn't really know the game at all, first you would describe, there's 3 lanes that make up the entire game, and traditionally, one person goes to each lane, 2 people are in the bot lane, so it's a 2v2, and you fight over minions, and you kind of try and kill the enemy champions, but minions are largely how you get gold, and then you have a jungler that goes and kills these neutral creeps, and then sometimes he'll go into the lanes and try and they call it gank to kill you. And that's how they try and then take turrets to eventually kill the Nexus. And then there are these huge objectives called Baron and Dragon that you can take, in between. And that helps you power up and level up to where you can beat the enemy team. And those are super big objectives, and they're very important. That's how you would describe League of Legends to a newbie that has no idea what a MOBA even is to begin with. And with that in mind, Riot have constructed their game to where these objectives are very obvious, right? Going for Baron is very obvious. There's a big animation that happens on the map to where, Baron explodes from the rift and he's like tunneling under the ground and shit. And then, there's the terrain changes and how the entire map warps to, the mountain drake with the fucking walls everywhere, or the fire everywhere if it's Infernal Drake. It's a very theatrical, cinematic type thing within the game, and it's to let you know, hey, this is really fucking important. You guys need to go for this. And there's even timers up top that tell you when to go for that specific objective, and there's even indicators on the map that, turn from gray to yellow, and then okay, it's on the map, we need to go. So Riot has conditioned the entire player like a fucking Skinner box or something to go for these goals. But an early game team composition doesn't necessarily want to go for, all these drakes, because they know they're on a limited time scale and they probably won't get a soul drake anyways. The point of an early game team composition is to prevent the enemy from getting soul too soon, because it's only a matter of time usually before the enemy gets soul. So you want to be able to stack the first or second drakes, and then after that you're kind of fucked, and you should have already accelerated the game quite a bit to a stage to where, okay, you don't have to worry about the enemy getting soul because you're going to be ending the game beforehand. That's what an early game team composition is about, which also puts pressure on you to get things accomplished. And I think when people are playing League of Legends, they generally don't have a goal in mind when they're playing it. They aren't, what the pro players or the team psychologists call being present. But it is true. A lot of players aren't present when they look at the game or the game state and they decide what actions that they want to do. Generally, they're just reacting to the enemy, or they're trying to find little openings in the 1v1 or 2v2. But other than that, they have no real goals, and the game points them to the goals because, that's how Riot has kind of constructed it, like I was saying before. But it takes much more discipline to use an early game team composition because you have to create your own goals, right? So there's one instance actually that kind of sprung this to my mind from remembering it a little bit, which was I played a game with Spica. This was early on in the season when I was like climbing up to Masters, and I got in a game with him because he had first started his there's no fucking way that I would normally play with Spica, but the point is, I got in a game with him. I was playing support and he was playing Lilia jungle, and he accelerated the game like fucking crazy. And now keep in mind, when Spica was playing in the LCS, he actually was a really good early game jungler. He would get first blood quite often. I think he was up on gold difference. He was like the first in the league. He was first for XP difference. And so he's a really good early game jungler, and he knows how to accelerate the game. And during this game, we were invading a shit ton, and I was getting vision priority for him to be able to invade and keep pressure on one side of one quadrant of the map. And, he would go towards the bot lane and basically section off that entire map so that we could take bot lane turret. But the point is that that's a player that knows how to play the early game really quickly. But a lot of players don't have that ability or that skill. And it showed me the difference between a player that knows how to play towards the early game and a player that doesn't. So one huge thing that I think has condition the player base to not go for early game team compositions and why they're so hated is because Riot has introduced a lot of comeback mechanics. If you think, okay, there are bounties, first of all, bounties are the inherent nature of what you would call a comeback mechanic. They literally give you gold for killing someone that is better than you. Like, if there isn't more of a blue turtle shell Mario Kart scenario, I don't know what the fuck is. So the game rewards you for being behind and for not being good during the early game. Secondly, they introduce Elder Drake, right? That's another comeback mechanic to where, well, if we lost all the fucking all the drakes and we have to fight for soul, maybe we can steal the soul, steal the Elder Drake, and then we can get the buff, and then that instantly gives us power, and it gives you like 20k in fucking gold and stats so that you can automatically execute people and you have insane damage. It's a huge comeback mechanic if it ever comes to that. Then you have catch-up XP. Catch-up XP, now junglers can't ever get behind in XP, nor top laners, because you're always in range within the minions, or you're always able to at least get a camp, which will then have extra XP because you're behind the enemy jungler. So the entire game is riddled with a ton of comeback mechanics, which then means that it's hard to play an early team composition because now the enemy is able to come back and to get these extra things that literally the game of League of Legends just give you in order to play the fucking game and to continue playing. And largely I think this is because it's not fun to get completely stomped in the game. So at least you have some fun when you're losing the game. That's the reason for a comeback mechanic. It's all like psychological. So people don't get too pissed and they want to continue and play the next game and play the next game, right? Because otherwise, if it were a game like, say, StarCraft or Quake, if you're losing and you're losing in the beginning, you're just going to lose harder and harder and harder towards the end. And not only that, but League of Legends does have a real issue when it comes to snowball mechanics because it's a game of progression. The entire game at minute 1, all those decisions snowball into leads, and they extend to make your character more powerful because you get more items, because you get more levels, and that leads to obviously more power. So other games, they rectify that just by being a first-person shooter like Counter-Strike. They don't have necessarily that great of comeback mechanics because the round restarts every time. You get new weapons every time, or you keep your old weapons, and you start from square one. So that's the inherent problem with League of Legends, is that they have to kind of put some comeback mechanics in there because the game inherently is so snowbally. But with that said, they've also made turrets harder to kill, right? Which has increased the difficulty of early game team compositions. You think of something like a Lucian or a Jace or whatever, there's been increased in base damage to turrets. There's been heating up damage has been increased. Damage reduction, fortification, the first 5 minutes, I think it is, of the game, the turrets have 50% damage reduction. So they inherently make it to where you can't take turrets very early, or you can't chunk them very early. Increased health, they've over the years put more and more health into the turrets because they were so easy to take and they were paper thin. Everyone kind of joked before. They've reduced the turret plate gold. They've increased resistances per number of champions nearby. So they make it to where you can't even send, say, your jungler to zone, the enemy team off of the turret, and then you kind of take the turret top lane or maybe mid lane or bot lane. They increase the resistances so that you can't fucking do that. So it's clear that it becomes harder and harder as they introduce these elements in the game to where it fundamentally makes it more difficult to play the early game because you have less advantages that you can kind of snowball your lead off of. Now, speaking of snowballing leads and what a lead actually is, I think people get confused what a lead is. Because when you look at the scoreboard, you think, oh, okay, we're up 5 kills. That means we're in the lead. Maybe we're up, I don't know, like 2k gold, if it's in the first 10 minutes or something, and you're able to get a little bit of a CS. Maybe my bot lane is up 5 CS or 10 CS, my mid lane's up 15 CS. Like, all of these different calculations are very hard to, I guess, boil down into a real number because you're just guessing at the end of the day. When you look at the top of the LCS, we're able to see the gold difference, yes, but in game, you aren't really able to see the gold difference. So you don't know how much advantage that you actually have when you have a early game team composition. So one big part of that is obviously psychological, that as you're running an early game team composition, oftentimes they don't look like they're in a heavy lead as you're playing the game. And that's because a lot of those leads are very intangible. Secondly, is that people traditionally think of leads as kills, which is inherent in the fucking scoreboard, right? It's like way up at the top, you see, okay, like we're up 5-2, and same thing within the LCS. You can see the scoreboard and just see, oh, okay, this team is up 5 kills. That means they're winning, but not necessarily. That you could look at the game state and the map and see, okay, these turrets have been taken, but this team hasn't taken this outer turret, which is actually really easy for them to get, which would then catch them up, I don't know, like 500 gold or half a K or a K gold if they're able to allow the minions to die to the turret while also grabbing a minion wave up there and whatnot. But a big thing is that I think a lot of people focus on kills too much, and they think that's what the advantage is. But in reality, what I think an advantage is actually HP. HP advantage is so huge in League of Legends, and people highly underestimate this, which is partly, I think, the reason why people are so adverse to playing early game team compositions, because a Lucian who's able to chunk you out of lane so that you have to recall and come back, that may not be a kill, but it's certainly a CS lead, or it's certainly a turret plate gold, or a myriad of things, or vision control so that your support is able to roam and get vision inside the enemy jungle and the bot area next to blue buff and tri-bush and things like that. Like, maybe that's the advantage that you get, but it's not such a hard number like a kill. And so I think people highly underrate HP advantage, which is generally what an early game team composition gets. And if you kind of philosophically think about it for a second, isn't that kind of what a kill is to begin with anyways? You just get them to 0 HP, and on top of that, more often than not, the kill is not actually what gets you the lead. It's what you do after and what you do during the death timer that gets you the lead. Do you get a turret plate? Do you get to crash a minion wave so that they don't get that 7 or 6 minions of gold? Do you go get a Drake during the time of their death? Do you go get grubs during that time? Do you go invade to take part of their quadrant of the jungle? Those are the things that actually get you ahead. It's not necessarily the kill. So people are too focused on the kill itself. Secondly, invading to isolate winning matchups is how you get an early game team composition ahead. And I think this is kind of the part of the focus to where people don't know how to win with an early game team composition. And like I said, HP advantage is one way, which then snowballs into objectives around wherever you got that HP advantage. Secondly is invading to isolate winning matchups. Invading in itself can be an objective for your early game team composition. It's, can I invade to get this ward down here? That's a little mini objective. Can I invade to go and steal, this enemy wraith camp? That's a team objective. And notice how I say this is a team objective. It's not an individual objective, because you're all an entire team, obviously, power of fucking friendship. But it also helps you snowball the game. And that's how you have to think of it in the early game as well, too. Because like I said before, Riot has kind of conditioned you to think, this is my lead. I'm stomping lane. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. But it's more so in reality, especially with a early game team composition. This is how our team operates, and this is how our team composition functions. A lot of people don't fucking think of that. Now, second and lastly, I guess, is people are afraid of running early game team compositions because there are no big go buttons generally for an early game team composition. You think of champions that have big go buttons, say a Maokai. Maokai's a tank. Tanks generally turn on during the mid game and late game so that they are able to frontline. But the purpose of a tank of itself in a team composition is to make sure that there's a kind of delineated line so that your carries can operate and do damage safely in the back line. But a Maokai doesn't really belong in an early game team composition. But with that said, one of the big things that he provides to a team composition is a big go button. Is his fucking ult. It fucking covers the entire screen and it roots everybody. I don't think there's a bigger go button than like a Malphite ult. But even going to kind of, I guess, the professional scene and like professional team compositions and like big go buttons in there, those are still relevant. I forgot what team back in the day they couldn't function. I'm pretty sure it was CLG back in 2020. I think it was 2020 or 2021. They couldn't function as a team without big go buttons. They would run something like a Galio team composition to where there'd be a Galio that charges in onto a Jarvan, that fucking just wombo combos and make shit happen. And they would run a Malphite top. So it was just a huge, big go button team composition. And I think that's what trips up a lot of players, is that a big go button it's more beneficial when you're doing it in solo queue, especially because it's a big signal like, hey, we need to go in now. This guy just did this huge ultimate, which signals, okay, we need to go in now. But even in the LCS, for instance, it's a good, easy way for teams to shore up communication weaknesses that they have. They aren't able to plan out and say, okay, we need to do this, or we need to wait for these cooldowns from the enemy to blow, or wait for my cooldown that is, is really seen on the off screen and it doesn't really CC anyone, but it helps a fucking ton. Not having that and not having that signal to actually go is a huge problem, and early game team compositions don't really have that. So those are the big reasons why early game team compositions just kind of suck in League of Legends. Like I said, they are inherently just bad in League of Legends itself because Riot has introduced so many different comeback mechanics that you could just largely ride it out for the most part when it comes to that, and then you can get gold and come back if you're a Kale or some shit like that. And that's why in solo queue a lot of people get angry when they get destroyed later on in the game because of a late game team composition, but that's largely because that's how Riot has set that up, and people are conditioned to have to go for certain objectives, but those objectives are not really conducive to an early game team composition because there are more nuanced things that you can fight for, like I was saying, camps, invading, different things like that, and it takes more of a presence of mind to be an early game team composition and to try and win through that win condition. And that's why you actually don't see this a lot in professional play specifically.